Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week I'm going to try looking at sort of art theory a little bit. Now, if you're looking for a heavy academic discussion on art theory, you're in the wrong place. In fact, this is probably the wrong art channel for you. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm more interested in the practical applications. Can I actually take any of these ideas, get my head around them, understand what they are, and then apply them to my art? That's the sort of thing I'm interested in. If you're also interested in that sort of aspect of making art, then maybe you're in the right place. Before we get too deeply into it, I should say this is, give or take, this is July 2024, and it is about 4 years now since I started this art channel here on YouTube. What have I learned about making videos in that time? Probably not a lot. These videos are still unscripted and just me rambling, and there's no structure. Some people will like them. I guess some people won't. They want a bit more structure. So this video, what I'm trying to say is this video is just going to be me rambling on. It might make sense. It might not. Who knows? We'll see towards the end. And I'm going to try and rattle through things pretty quickly because, as I say, this can get very heavy very quickly. So we have in art theory this idea of art principles and art elements. We'll start with the elements because I think they're easier to understand. So we have line, shape, form, space, color, value, and texture. Well, obviously line and shape, just very briefly talk about those. We have a line. Now, a line is just a line, except it's not, because there's actually a lot you can do with a line. I did a video not too long ago about Matisse and some of the things I learnt from studying Matisse's art and things that I've tried to apply to my own art. Matisse, in my opinion, was a master of line and using line. A line, a humble line, can be a beautiful thing. It doesn't have to just be a straight, continuous weight sort of line. You can vary, if you're drawing a line with a pencil, you can vary the weight, the amount of pressure that you put on, and you can create different interesting effects. Now, I'm using digital just because it's convenient for me. It's easier to explain these things. But imagine you're using a pencil or something. You can create these sort of broken lines, continuous lines, curved lines, straight lines. What I'm trying to say is a line isn't just a line. It can be an awful lot. And you can create beautiful artwork just with lines. You can also combine lines with shapes. So you have a shape. Maybe the shape is defined by a color, but then you can put darker outlines around that. Vincent van Gogh used this technique. Gauguin used this technique. Toulouse-Lautrec. A lot of these sort of post-impressionist artists used this sort of approach, and some of it may have come from Japanese style art, the ukiyo-e, woodblock prints. It's a technique that they use, sort of flat shapes defined by color and with a darker outline. But anyway, it's something you can play around with, and don't dismiss the humble line. It can really raise your art to a new level, I think. You play around with them, just have fun with making lines. Next one on the list, of course, then is shape. Again, combine a bunch of lines and you can make a shape. By itself, shapes can be, of course, again, they can be interesting shapes, they can be boring shapes. But again, it is something that you can play around with. You can define, as I said, the shape with colors, or you can define shape by their outlines, or you can do both. Form. So what's the difference between shape and form? This is the way I understand it. Shape is just a two-dimensional thing like a circle or square or rectangle. But if you imagine trying to represent a three-dimensional thing, then you're talking about form. So if you're doing a portrait of someone, you can do it as a flat two-dimensional portrait, or you can try and indicate that there's depth, there's 3 dimensions to a person's head, not just a two-dimensional shape. When you get started with art, when I get started with art, in terms of landscapes, it is not uncommon to see landscapes that are quite flat. Now, at the beginner level, that's often because we don't know how to create a feeling of depth and space in our landscapes. So we end up drawing and painting things that look quite flat. So this is somewhere where I think studying a little bit of the art theory, understanding the difference between a shape and a form, and also then understanding concepts of perspective, linear perspective, aerial perspective, and so on. So how do you use shapes and lines to create a feeling of depth? How do you use color to create a feeling of depth? The use of details or the lack of details. These can all help to create form and create this feeling of depth and space within your painting. Once you've learnt all of that and you know how to apply it, you then have a choice. You can then decide to go back and create flat landscapes, or you can create more 3-dimensional landscapes. But because you've learnt that knowledge and you've sort of learnt how to apply it, you then have a choice, which at the beginner level you didn't have a choice. You're just creating flat 2-dimensional landscapes because that's the only thing you knew how to do. So I guess what I'm trying to say is learning some of this theory is useful, it is important, and it opens up choices and options. And once you have the ideas and you understand the theory, you then have the option, the choice, which way do you want to go? Do you want to use linear perspective and so on, or do you want to create a flatter landscape painting? So shape and form, interesting. Try and learn a bit about things like perspective and so on, and then you'll open up new possibilities and new choices in your artwork. Space, well, if we go back to the idea of shapes, the outline of the shape, of course, defines the space within the shape, if that makes sense. We also have the space around the shape, and we have the space between shapes as well. That's starting to get a bit abstract. How do we actually use this? One way of thinking about it is, let's say we have, if I jump to another one, this is a little sketch I did earlier this morning, a little digital sketch. We have a simple vase, or vase if you prefer, with some flowers. It's all quite abstract, but you get the idea. These flowers, of course, are different shapes, but there's also the space between the flowers. And the way that you arrange the flowers, the way that you play around with that space, that can create very different looking final results. So space, it is abstract. It's a bit more difficult to think about how we use it, but we can use space and we can play around with it and create different final results, final images. So I wouldn't reject the concept of space. I say it is a bit more abstract, but it is worth playing around with. And this is one of the reasons why I like digital art. It is possible to sort of move things around in a way that would be more difficult. You know, I can move this flower around if I want, in a way that would be difficult with, or even impossible, with more traditional media. So it is one thing that I do like about digital art. So we go back to our list. Okay, so we've got line, shape, form, space. Color, well, we don't need to illustrate color. We all know what color is. But again, color theory is a whole thing in itself. And it's, again, it's worth studying. some of these ideas and trying to think about how you can actually practically apply those ideas to your own art. Value, if you imagine everything black and white, is it light, is it dark, somewhere in the middle? That's your values. Value isn't something that I use a huge amount these days in my art. Originally I was interested in it, but these days, as I've moved further away from naturalistic style of painting, I'm not that interested in values anymore. At the moment, I may become more interested in them in the future. I say this is not set in stone, any of this that I'm saying. These are just ideas that I'm thinking in my head at this moment in time, and I could completely change my mind tomorrow or next Tuesday or whatever, whenever. So color and value. The last thing, texture. Texture is something that I really don't explore or play with, but texture, again, in my understanding, if we look at this painting by Vermeer, and I think Vermeer was particularly good at creating a feeling of texture. So we have, I think this painting has a highly original name, something like Girl in the Red Hat or something like that. But it's a very good example of texture in paintings. So she's wearing these blue sort of silky robes, and she has this red sort of fluffy hat on. And how do we get the feeling of texture? So if you look at the way Vermeer uses reflections, the way the light reflects off the surface and also the edges, there are two things that are very important in creating this feeling of texture. So with the silky robe, we're getting quite sharp, hard reflections of light, whereas on the hat, it's a more diffuse reflection. And the hat, that helps to create the feeling that the hat is sort of fluffy as opposed to very smooth. And then, of course, the edges where he has a rough, diffuse, softer edge compared to the harder edges of the robe. So anyway, this is ways in which people can create texture. And I think reflections and edges are very important in that sense. So it's not really something I play around with much, although I do with watercolor. I do play around with edges to create the feeling of, for example, clouds in the sky, using a more diffuse, softer edges, and then harder edges in the land, in the landscape itself. But some artists really put a lot of emphasis on this idea of texture. So those are elements. Now, principles are more, I think, a bit more abstract, a little bit more, it's easy to see how we can apply the elements to our own art. Things like lines and shapes and spaces and so on. Concepts like unity, balance, contrast, movement, they're slightly more abstract, and how exactly do we create them is a bit more tricky. But this first one, unity, we're not going to go through all of these because it would take far too long, but if you look at one or two of them, unity, if you go back to this little sketch I did, unity, as I understand it, is the way that the different elements within your picture combine. Are they tied together? Are they related to each other? Or are they just completely separate elements and shapes within the image? So, for example, you might use the shape itself, a repeating shape, as to create a feeling of unity, or you could use color, or both. So in this little sketch, in the top right, I have this sort of abstract shape, sort of a darkish blue color. Down in the bottom left, I have a different shape, but the color is basically the same. So it's creating a link between those two areas. It's helping to create this feeling of unity. The vase, the flowers, they're same color, or very similar color. So again, it's creating this feeling of unity. Unity and variety. To create unity in a painting, you could simply do something like this. That is a very unified painting. It's just one shape, it's just one color. But I think we can all agree it's not the most interesting piece of art in the world. So yes, unity is a good thing, but too much unity is probably a bad thing. You want a bit of variety as well. So using a few different colors and different shapes, you have to find that balance. And that balance is also, again, one of these principles of art. A balance between a unified image, but also an image that has enough variety to be interesting. Balance can also be used in, again, in landscape painting. Imagine a landscape where you have a horizon line and maybe a few trees on the left hand side. Do you put something on the right hand side to balance it out? Do you have an unbalanced landscape? To me, there isn't one rule that says this one is better than that one. It's choices. Because at the end of the day, art is all very subjective. One person will look at a piece of art and think it's amazing. Another person will think, it's not so good. So it is very subjective. But these ideas like balance and unity and variety, they are certainly interesting things to think about and to play around with. In terms of when you watch videos or read blog articles about composition, one of the things that people often focus on is maybe emphasis and a focal point, something that you want the viewer to notice maybe first when they look at your painting or your drawing. And one of the ways of doing that is positioning the focal point. And then you get into all this grid methods and things like the rule of thirds and all of that sort of nonsense, and people portray composition as just that. That's what it is. It's how you place your center of interest, your focal point. What I would say is there's a lot more to composition, there's a lot more to art than just emphasizing one thing. And if you take away anything from this video, maybe that's the thing that I want to emphasize. Composition is an incredibly complex thing because it's broken up into all of these principles and elements. They all feed into the composition. Composition is not just about where you place the focal point. And of course, you could have a painting or a drawing that has no focal point. That's also a possibility. There's no one part of the painting that really stands out from everything else. Okay, I think that's probably enough for today. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching and listening. Seriously, thank you for watching and listening, because I know it is rambly and difficult to follow. Hopefully see you again in next week's video.